Hi, everyone. This is Luisa Lemy with ASUA Online. If you're listening to this, you know about the One Big Beautiful Bill. I'm sure you heard of it. It's making its way through the US Congress right now. But there's a small tax that could have a big impact across Latin America and the Caribbean stuck in that bill. In 2024, migrants sent more than $160 billion home to Latin America and the Caribbean. Not in a humanitarian aid or development assistance, but in remittances. Remittances are the money migrants send home to support their families.
Remittances of US dollars to Mexico represent around 4% of this country's GDP, and the proposed tax is projected to cost this country's economy over $2.6 billion.
We have a special guest to talk about the US government plans to put a 3.5% tax on the money today. But the person interviewing this guest was Karen Zessis, our longtime host, editor-in-chief of ASUA Online. Welcome back, Karen. And I know that this tax, it's not for everybody, right?
Hey, Luisa, thank you. It's so great to be back. And you're right, this tax isn't going to apply to all migrants sending home, just to people mostly who are undocumented migrants who will have to cough up this extra cash every time they want to send money home to their families using money senders like, say, Western Union or MoneyGram.
Yeah, we know, like if you live in places where there are a lot of migrants, you have seen it. The doors, remittances. They're places that you go when you want to send money home. And that's the kind of places that you were talking about. That's how the tax will be collected, right, Karen? So is this all connected with this push from the US government to curb irregular migration?
Definitely, because the amount of money that they're expecting to raise from this, about $2.7 billion, is really a drop in the bucket for the United States. So it's really about controlling irregular migration and that big push to do it.
So, Karen, you have told me before that in Latin America, the country that most receives remittances, it's Mexico. Can you explain a little bit how did the Mexican government react to that proposal?
Right. So the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, stands really strongly against this measure, and she argues that Mexican migrants already pay their fair share of taxes in the United States.
Y nosotros dijimos claramente que no estamos de acuerdo con eso, porque nuestros hermanos que están allá trabajan duro y pagan sus impuestos. Y es injusto que además haya un impuesto por el dinero que le mandan a sus familias.
This is such a big issue in Mexico that already, on 2 occasions, groups of Mexican senators representing major political parties have come to Washington to try to talk to Congress here and argue against the measure. Now, we know that we're talking about large sums of money in the case of Mexico. Mexicans sent over $60 billion home in remittances last year alone. But a little further south, money sent home to Central American countries like Guatemala and El Salvador runs around 20 to 25% of GDP.
Wow, that's crazy. So, why are we talking about this right now? You said that it's a drop in a bucket for the US economy. It matters a lot for those families in those specific regions and Central American countries. Why is it important to discuss remittances right now?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, this tax on remittance is part of the US's larger push to try to control immigration in the country. But it also could have a big economic impact for the reasons I just spoke about. And the thing that's been interesting is that remittances really have been growing for years. They continue to grow through the pandemic, defying expectations. And suddenly we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown.
That is interesting. So the slowdown came after. So who did you speak with to understand better what is happening with remittances right now?
I spoke with René Maldonado of the Center for Latin American Monetary Studies, known as SEMLA. He's worked closely with the Inter-American Development Bank and other hemispheric organizations for 20 years, really analyzing data on remittance flows across the Americas.
The families that depends of these flows depends on this to survive. It's not to make a party or it's not to be fun or go to holiday. No, it is to survive. So it's a compromise of the migrants with these families. I think that kind of tax is not going to affect the remittances because the families need that money.
And in this episode, we really talked about why have remittances slowed down? What will the impact of something like this type of tax be on remittances? And to what degree will migrants who really need to send money home, where this is a situation where for many families it's something that they really rely on, will they absorb the cost?
Okay, I'm ready to listen to this interview. I would say before we start, don't forget to subscribe to Latin American Focus, send it to your friend, and if you haven't already, press that button that you like this episode. Welcome back, Karen Zissis. Let's get into it.
Thank you. So great to be back with you, Lou.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Thank you so much, René, for being with us here on Latin America in Focus.
Thank you very much to you to invite me to talk about this important issue for all the Latin American and Caribbean countries and the impact of this on the families that receive this kind of flows.
We're talking today about remittances in part because they have become, to some degree, part of a news story, which is in the United States, there's currently a bill up for discussion that's been dubbed the Big Beautiful Bill that is making its way through the U.S. Congress right now. And one of the elements in this bill is a tax on remittances. Before we dive into the details, can you paint a picture for us of how you see remittance trends changing or evolving in 2025 or over the past year or so?
Nowadays, we have figures and data till the second quarter of 2025. So it is nice because we could divide this history of remittances in at least three phases. The first one is what you say, the close of the 2024. It shows that the remittances are grow, not as much as the past years, but it is still growing. It's based on a growing migrants, Latin Americans in the United States, and also growing in the labor force in United States. The second phase is the first quarter of 2025. It is really interesting because all the things like migration and labor force in the United States are not stopped, but growing really slow. And even though the remittances are growing at a pace of 10.2% compared with the past year. How is happening? How is it possible if you don't have migrants and if you don't have these migrants in the labor force, how the remittances grow? What we have found is they were using the savings that they have and they are trying to send as much money as they can before these things like the taxes and all the other things that are affecting the migrations take into action in the United States. So they are sending this money, avoiding this thing. But this is not what the migrants can do all the time. And it's take us to the third phase and the second quarter of 2025. The migrants don't have more savings to send. And also they have problems keeping the labor force in the United States. They have to stop sending that money that we're sending in the first quarter. And the remittances are going down. So I want to talk just a little bit to Mexico because it is part important of the remittances. At least 1/3 of the remittances that receive Latin American comes from Mexico. Mexico has been showing interesting behavior in the remittances and also in the migration. The last years, not only the last year, but the last years, the migration from Mexico to United States has been slow pacing. Why is this? Mexico has a better economic conditions and also tight economic conditions in the United States are making that the Mexicans don't go as much as in the past to the United States. So that influenced a lot the remittances that all the region has been receiving. And also, if there is no Mexicans to work in United States, they are leaving these spaces for the other migrants from other countries, like Central Americans. One important part of the remittances are this kind of cyclicity in the remittances, and it's marked by some specific dates in the year that are important for the migrants and the families. One of the most important is the Mother's Day. Statistics that we have shows that every time that it comes, the remittances grow 6 to 7% more than in the past. It doesn't happen this year because the migrants don't have that money to send to the families. So Mexico have shown an important decrease in the remittances, especially in April of this year, 12.5%.
A big decrease. I was about to ask you about this decrease that we've seen happening in Mexico because I was surprised to see that in April, even before this remittance tax talk began, Mexico witnessed a significant year on year drop in remittances. So that drop was 12%, which was the sharpest monthly decline in 13 years. But we were also seeing reports that remittances had gone up in the case of certain Central American countries. Why that contrast? Is that just we're still looking at first quarter numbers when we're looking at Central America? Is there a different dynamic going on with Central American countries compared to Mexico in terms of sending money back?
This is important because Mexico is nearby United States and there's a lot of people crossing the border lines, and they could use this kind of people to send some of the money that they used to send for other things. Also, the development of digital transfers, wallets, and cryptocurrencies, something like that, can help the migrants to send that money. There are a lot of problems there in United States if they can't use the usual channels to send the money. Mexicans can send the money by families, friends that are crossing the border. So in the official figures, it's not as easy as you could think to catch all that kind of flows. And we could show not a real decrease in the remittances, but a decrease in the official remittances sent by the traditional means.
There is this big focus on remittances to Mexico because something about $65 billion went to Mexico in terms of remittances last year. It's the second biggest remittance recipient in the world after, I believe, India. On 2 occasions already, Mexico has sent a group of Mexican senators from across different parties to try to raise attention in Washington about the tax on remittances and their concerns on these taxes. There's been a lot of media in the case of Mexico and these concerns around the tax on remittances. However, we need to keep in mind that when we look at Mexico, remittances account for maybe around 3% or 3.2% of Mexico's GDP, while in Central America and Caribbean countries, remittances are an immense part of their economy. So some estimates put remittances to Guatemala and El Salvador around 25% of GDP. And not only that, but Central American migrants, from some of the research we've done, send a bigger chunk of their paycheck home than Mexicans do. So, what does a tax on remittances mean for those countries?
This is really interesting what you said, because for Mexican and some other countries, maybe the remittances are not a big part of the GDP, but it's a big part of the income of poor families. So there is a lot of poor families in Mexico that depends on this for survival. So when we talk on the GDP, but this is in the macro view that we have of remittances. But when we're talking about the families, there is a different picture. Even in Mexico, millions of families depends on these flows. So it is also important for them.
And it's a little bit tricky to compare a country like Mexico that just in terms of population and size is so much larger, right, than some of these Central American countries that we're talking about. But what I'm curious about, what does a tax on remittances mean for these Central American countries where such a huge portion of the GDP is connected to remittances?
First of all, I think the US government is not doing this because they need more resources, because this kind of resources that they can obtain from remittances, 3.5% or whatever, the rate is negligent compared with the total budget of the US. So it's not because they need money. That has to be clear. it has another kind of goal, I think, in it is to try to catch the illegal immigrants. That is the main idea. And the second one is the resilience of the remittances. When we have to live in the pandemic, in the crisis of COVID-19, we see that every analyst in the world has been wrong when they think that the remittances are dropping to the floor because the migrants can work and things like that. And what we have assessed in that time is that the remittances grow incredible more than they grow in the past years. Why is it? Because the families that depends of these flows depends on this to survive. It's not to make a party or it's not to be fun or go to holiday. No, it is to survive. So it's a compromise of the migrants with these families. I think that kind of tax is not going to affect the remittances because the families need that money. And the migrants are going to absorb that tax in order to keep sending money to his families as in the past, or as much they could change the channels that they used to send. And it is not a good news for the market because the market take 10 to 15 years to make this market more legal, more transparent. And nowadays, or before these things, the market was 95 to 98% in the formal market. This is banks, this is money transfers operators and things that reports every time, every month to the authorities. They have controls to anti-money laundering and all the things that they built around the remittances. So we are sure that the flows that are coming from some countries are remittances, that if some people can do that, they have to change these channels to the past. So they will send money in the pockets of some travelers, families, friends, and things like that. They could use digital channels or wallets or things like that. As a recommendation for the authorities in the region is to strengthen the things that they use to compile this kind of information, especially include this kind of new channels, because we need that information. We need to know how it is affecting the families, if the income of the families will be affected or not. My perception and what we see till now is that the income in the families in Latin America and Caribbean will not be affected as we think.
That's really interesting. One thing that I've been hearing is a concern that due to these taxes, there could be illicit flows, that money could be sent back through illicit means, perhaps through organized criminal groups. Maybe it's sort of one of these things that you could send it back through if you used a coyote or a smuggling group to travel to the United States. Would you contact those groups to send the money? But one of the things that you're talking about is by changing this and by forcing people to find other means, you have the potential that just in general, the data becomes less clear, the information becomes less clear. And one of the things that I was wondering about is, if we looked at how this bill has changed, there was a House version, and now there's a version that's made it through the Senate Finance Committee, and we've seen some important changes. A lot of the language was softened, and it at first exempted U.S. citizens, and then more broadly changed that language so that anyone who had a valid Social Security number would be exempted. Now, still, this would call on those immigrants to be sharing their information when they are transferring funds, right? So you could say that perhaps in this climate in which we've been hearing a lot about immigrants being anxious about new immigration policy, that they might not want to hand over some of that information. To what degree do you think that could have an impact on their sending patterns and on their thinking in terms of sending money home?
Okay, the first part is very important. I don't talk about illicit channels to send money because the migrants never use illicit channels. They are going to use new forms to send money that could be out of the sight of the authorities. That means that these are illicit. For example, in the case of Mexico in the second quarter of 2025, I say some of the Mexicans are choose to send the money by family and friends that travel to Mexico, and they say,
Mm.
okay, please take this money, give it to my mom instead. And those no are illicit, but obviously are out of the sight of the authorities. Also, when they use another means that are more new, like currencies, wallets, or digital means that not always are under the scope of the authorities nowadays. There are no illicit things in this part. They are only out of the site because we are not considered as a part of traditional channels for the remittances. What happens when we have a part of the community of these migrants that are legal and the other ones that are illegal, and we put some restriction for the illegal migrants in order to send that money home? What happens? They are community, they all know each other. So maybe the first thing that could be happen is, okay, I don't have papers. I want to send this money to my mom. Please, can I use your channel? Can you send this to your mom and your mom can take this money and give it to my mom and things like that? Maybe what we could check in this case is to check the average of remittances each month in order to see if this is growing or not. So there is a lot of channels that the migrants, legal and illegal, can use to send money. So I don't think that this kind of tax could be a stop for the remittances.
I want to ask a question specifically about the Caribbean. This is based on some data from the World Bank. In many cases, sender fees and exchange price differences can really put a dent into what people send home. So, per the World Bank, while those fees might end up leading to eating up about 4.5% of what's sent to a country like El Salvador or Mexico, that could rise to as much as 7% to Jamaica or the Dominican Republic, which are both countries that are big remittance receivers. In the case of Cuba, it's even higher, it's something like 11%. So, what will the impact of measures like these and immigration trends in general, but these types of taxes on remittances be in the cases of Caribbean countries?
What happens with Caribbean countries is that the flows that they receive each country are too tiny, are not big as Mexico and all those. So a little change in the flows for the Caribbean countries looks like a big ones because in terms of the percentages are really big when you change just a little bit. So that's why sometimes in the Caribbean case, we take a little more time in order to analyze the data because sometimes it could be tricky to understand that part of things. So what is going to happen? The same as in the rest of Latin American and the Caribbean countries, they are going to suffer that part of the tax in the same way.
Hmm. So, Renee, we've been talking about this tax on remittances, but I'm interested now, as we've gone over all of these different issues, if you could talk a little bit about what you see in the future around remittance issues, particularly given concerns around mass deportations, changes in immigration policy affecting large groups of immigrants, Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, through things like cancellation of temporary protected status. What sorts of things do you anticipate happening for remittances as you look to the future?
The deportations and things related with that kind of measures that are happening in the United States are creating a kind of fear in the migrants. We used to divide the working population from Latin America and the Caribbean in the United States between women, men, and if they have or not have a legal stay in the United States. And what we have checked till the first quarter, because we don't have now the second quarter figures, but for the first quarter is that some of the women's working from Latin American are decreasing more than the men.
Hmm.
And also obviously are decreasing the people working that don't have a legal status in the United States. What does it mean? That some of the people are hiding, they don't want to work to avoid these deportations, especially the women. Why the women? Because the women used to have kids and children and they don't want to be deported and leave the kids there or things like that. So this is important in the future because it's not only the deportations by itself, because it is important because it affects families, but also the fear that it is creating between the community. And this fear that is creating in the community are reducing the labor market and also reducing the remittances that they send by formal means because they don't want to go, as you mentioned earlier, they don't want to go to these money transfer operators and provide some kind of information that could be dangerous for them in order that they could be see as target to deportation. So that's the problem in this time. And what's happened with these people that used to have legal status in the United States. Not only, as you mentioned, these Venezuelans and things like that, but also there are other people that live there because they are part of some kind of natural disasters like the Hondurans, and that they are living there under this special treatment, for example. What happened with them? They are feared. They don't know what is going to happen in the future. So this is the worst part of this thing, the fear that is creating these kind of measures.
So there's the possibility we could see some real changes happening.
I think 5 years ago or something like that, some organization performed some kind of survey between the migrants of Latin America and the Caribbean in the United States about how they contribute to the budget of the United States, because they want to know if they taxes and
Hmm.
if they pay social security. And what's amazing, because a lot of these people that they don't have legal status, they pay taxes and they pay social security. And the next question in that survey was, why you pay? You never have this kind of
Hmm.
benefits when you are retired, when you have problems with your health. You're not going to have this. Why you pay it? And the responses were really interesting. They think that if they pay, they are more close to obtain this kind of legal status in the United States. So as much as we know, a lot of these migrants are paying these taxes, are paying these contributions. So it is not a change in this kind of things. If they could pay another taxes for the remittances, it's just another pay that they are going to assume.
Mm-hmm. It's a contribution with a hope for the future.
Yes.
René, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and talking to us about these issues. This has been a really interesting conversation because I feel as though you've busted a lot of myths for me. There are certain things when I have these conversations with people about this remittance issue that come up over and over again. Oh, well, it hurts Mexico, but it's really going to hurt these other countries that get a greater portion of GDP. You've sort of busted the myth of illicit flows and money being sent through cartels or something like that. So I really appreciate that you have a more nuanced view. So thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise with us.
It's nice to talk to you, and everything that you need, here I am.
Thanks for listening. Karen Zissis and I hosted this episode. This episode was produced by Kalia Robertson and Fabricio Ricalde. I'm Luisa Lemy, executive producer for the show. For more of our coverage on the impact of Trump's policy in Latin America, visit as-coa.org/Trump to keep up to date with trade, migration, and more. And check the show notes to learn more about the IDB's research on remittances. The music in this podcast is Sonora y sus ojos negros, performed for America Society by Suspenso del Norte, a Mexican norteño father-son duo based in Queens, New York.
Es que durmió entre mis brazos en San Luis Río Colorado, y al cantarle a sus ojazos de canto en su lindo estado.
You also heard Lamentos do Morro by Brazilian legend Garoto, performed by Felipe Reis. Find out about upcoming concerts at www.musicoftheamericas.org. And if you like the soundtrack of this podcast, consider becoming a member of America Society for preferential access to all concerts here at 6080 Park Avenue in New York, as well as art exhibitions, book talks, and more exciting events. Check the link in our show notes to learn more. If you listen up to here, check out other episodes of Latin American Focus at as-coa.org/podcast. Or write us an email telling what you think at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share with other Latin America aficionados and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more, visit as-coa.org.